winged this stuff into the back of the cab like crazy. Drove down the lanes, you know. So
Oh yeah, the little lanes.
Yeah, you know, heel and toe.
Was that
crazy.
your first time to England?
No, I'd been.
So
there
you're sort of
before.
familiar with it.
I was a little bit familiar with it.
Yeah.
I got down to the Admiral Benbow Inn, and a guy greeted me and said, "Welcome to the Admiral Benbow Inn."
Arr, arr.
And
It's all very pirate-like.
Yeah,
then,
pirate-like stuff.
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, this is our first time in Cornwall."
That's a pretty good accent.
It's Long John Silver crap.
Yeah.
Robert Sylvester with it. And he says, "I'd recommend tonight at dinner, I'd recommend the crab omelette. Very tasty."
Because that's how they spoke when I was growing up, you know.
I know, it's great. It's just absolutely great. And I have a friend down there. I haven't seen him in years and years, an underwater filmmaker. And,
So you must have been quite young at that point, yeah? First advertising job?
25, 28, somewhere in that.
But you'd grown up stateside, up
I
north?
grew up in New York City, for God's sakes. You know, underwater photographers aren't supposed to grow up in New York City.
How do you grow up in New York City and become an underwater photographer? I mean, it rains a lot, but I mean the puddles aren't that deep, are they?
Well, we had a summer home. It was on the Jersey coast, a little town called Elbron, New Jersey. And that's where I really began to dive. And Elbron, New Jersey, a little bit like diving, you know, off, off hotels. I want to say not Yorkshire, but not Cornwall, because Cornwall is clear water.
Yes, it is actually, isn't it?
It's like diving the Bristol Channel, but not
just murky.
Yeah,
and
but not with the tides.
Yeah.
And some days you could see your flippers, and some days you couldn't.
Was anyone in your family a diver?
No, nobody dove in my
Who?
family.
So how do you? Was there a dive outfit there, or?
I went to a summer camp. Now,
Okay.
it's a kind of a story that I've told and retold, but when I think about it, and it's very funny. In New York, most of the kids in New York, well, middle-class kids, were sent to summer camps in the Adirondacks, where you'd climb mountains and you'd go horseback riding and you'd play baseball and you'd have archery, and then there'd be riflery, and then there'd be a waterfront where you could sail and canoe.
But no one was going diving.
And, you know, no one really dove. And I hated all of that. You know, I had asthma. The mountain climbing killed me. You know, I wheezed my way up a couple peaks, and I said, that's the end of it. You know, little 8-year-old, 9-year-old kid going, eh. And I'd always be the last. They'd always yell at me. And finally I said, you know, I just don't want to do this anymore. They didn't know what the hell to do with me. So they sent me down to the waterfront. And there at the waterfront was two teenage lifeguards, waterfront camp counselors. They call them junior counselors. And being 14 years old and bossing other little kids around was their absolute joy. For us, it was terror. And they said, "Here, kid, put on this mask." And they handed me, I remember, never forget it. It was a mask that was made by U.S. divers called a squale mask. It was a French blue mask. I said, "Well, what do you do?" And he said, "You put it on your face and you go like this so it doesn't leak. And go underwater and go and clean up that dock over there. It's full of branches and crap." And they sent me down there to do this because they'd seen, and it terrified them, they'd seen what's called a dock spider. Now, dock spider's the size of a dinner plate. Lives underwater. It's a water spider. And they wanted me to be terrified and come screaming out of the water. And I put my mask on. And all of a sudden, here was this other world. This incredible other world with shafts of light and small sunfish darting in and out and a little bit of green algae floating back and forth. And hey, the dock spider was over there and he looked great.
So he looked interesting to you.
He looked fabulous.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And that changed my life.
And you were 8 years old at that point?
8 or 9, you know, because I was born in November. I always lose track of how old you were in the
sort of
summer.
Yeah.
So it's always confusing. You're
I've
like
got- I've got-
younger than you seem to be until you get to November, and then you're old.
So I've got a question for you. I wonder if those young lads had any idea the career that you would go on and have after that first dive. Wouldn't that be
Well,
interesting to know?
Who knows? But then again, who knows what would happen to them? I mean,
Yeah.
would they rise up in the world of finance, or go into the military, or
Yeah, who knows where they
who knows
went,
where,
yeah.
what happened with them? So it was a very funny summer, because I knew instinctively that this was a pathway that I was on.
Even at 8
Even
years
then,
old. Yeah, yeah.
even 8 or 9 years old. And that fall, 1956, so I might have been 10. The Silent World premiered in New York City, the movie, and Jacques Cousteau was there. I remember it was in a theater on 58th Street called the Paris Cinema, right next to the Plaza Hotel. And it opened my eyes. I sat there with my cousin Peter and my Uncle Jack, and I just couldn't think of anything else but that, and that was the direction. And not only
Did
that,
you get
his
to
book
meet
was,
Jacques Cousteau?
Yes,
also?
I met Jacques Cousteau there. I burrowed through the
Did you?
legs and other.
So you'd
people.
been watching his stuff on TV, or was
This
this
is
the first?
way before that.
Oh,
This
is that right?
this
So he was
the-
early.
Yeah, The Silent World was his premiere of who Jacques Cousteau was to the world. The book, The Silent World, had been out for about 2.5 years, and it was a bestseller. And he had enough funding, strangely enough, to come down through the Mediterranean, the length of the Red Sea, and wind up in El Dabra and then Ascension Island, and made the film. The director was a young kid from Paris who we knew, named Louis Malle. That was the director, who went on to be an incredibly famous director, wonderful auteur filmmaker, and that's one of the reasons why this film was such a good film. It's very creaky and old now, because there's things we don't necessarily deal with, like there's a part where they catch a lot of sharks and they kill a lot of sharks, things like that then was taken for granted. But the film itself is in the beginning of it, is an absolutely beautiful piece of filmmaking, and it stands up to this day. And of course, that began to change the way the world contemplated the ocean. I said after a while, I don't want to swim around this jetty in New Jersey just trying to shoot a fish. I want to swim around this jetty in New Jersey trying to take a picture. And my father, who was a professor of surgery at NYU, New York University, came back with a anesthesiologist bag. I had an old mask. I looked in a book. It said you can take a mask and a bag, a rubber bag, and you can put a camera in there, and if you screw the mask back on, take the faceplate off and the ring, you have an underwater camera. You manipulate the controls through the side of the bag. And of course, when we first put it in the bag, we left the air in, so it was like a balloon underwater.
So that didn't work the first
You
time.
get the air out, and then you could take pictures. So of course, the first pictures were absolutely terrible. I keep joking that they said they were beyond abstract.
I wonder you didn't keep them, did you?
No,
they're
that's
gone.
long
years ago.
gone.
Yeah.
And I began to photograph, and
What age would you have been at this point?
I'm thinking I was 12.
Okay, so very young.
Yeah, I was 12 years old, and by 13, I managed to have a camera, 13 or 14, I think. I managed to have a camera that was made, an underwater camera that was made for a Leica, pre-war Leicas. New York at that time, all the camera shops were full of pre-war Leicas that the GIs brought back from Germany, where people bought and were just selling it for nothing, trading them in. Because over the horizon, the Japanese camera industry was beginning to build very slowly. And by the time the Vietnam War came around, the Nikon F was introduced. And that changed a lot of ways of what way people shot film. And of course, Leica produced the M3 later on. So all these, non-lever Leicas were just, lined the shelves, $15, $20 for a camera. Which, of course, that was a lot in those days, but it wasn't.
It wasn't the price of the new.
No,
versions.
it wasn't $150. It was affordable for a kid. And the housing was expensive. And the housing I got for my first sort of real working camera was called a Lewis Photomarine, made by the Lewis Camera Company in London. And it was, it had the ability, you had a choice. You could have a gear for focus, or you could have a gear for exposure, for f-stop, but you couldn't have both. So you had to decide what was more important. And obviously, focus is not passé. Focus is pretty damn important. So f-stop was out. So exposure, you have to figure it out for yourself and hope that the f-stop you set the camera on was good enough. Toward the end of the 60s, Nikon finally began to produce, and it was really Nikon. Nikon really was the leader in it. They finally began to produce much wider angle lenses, a 20 millimeter lens, a 24 millimeter lens. It was incredible stuff. And then Pentax produced a lens that was a very strange lens called a fisheye lens. You could see 180 degrees across the diagonal. Nikon produced fisheye lenses that produced a round picture. And those saw 180 degrees. At the same time, before Bates began to work on the Ocean Eye, Geographic gave a grant to a guy named Walter Stark, Dr. Walter Stark. And he said, I can put one of these fisheye lenses. It was an f5.6 Nikkor fisheye lens that you had to lock up the mirror housing to get the lens in. It had a long rear element tail on it. And it produced a round picture, the classic fisheye lens. First designed to look at star fields, and then people started shooting rock and roll pictures with it because, And Walter put this in a very small housing, a little compass dome with an aluminum housing around it, and that fit onto the Nikonis camera. And people began to shoot pictures with it. The American photographer Flip Schulke began to do a set of pictures of Shamu, the killer whale. And that was a grant from Geographic. It wasn't very much money, a couple grand. And Bates said, well, this lens is all right, but let's put an underwater camera. Let's make an underwater camera, a housing for a Nikon F. And Nikon had just come out with something called the Sports Finder, which was a larger view. It was designed for basically for football, where you hold your lens out here. And wider angle lenses. And the housing was an aluminum box with the controls, all the controls, f-stop, focus, the whole business. And instead of a flat plate in front of it, he made this dome. It's a plexiglass dome. It was used for a compass from the Danforth Compass Company. And of course, the Danforth compasses are Navy approved, so the plexiglass dome was a cast dome. And it had no ripples or bubbles on it. It was a breakthrough.
So I'm intrigued now. So what did you have to do to get back in to this guy and get approval?
Well, I got invited on an expedition. Stan Waterman had already shot pictures of garden eels as a filmmaker in Tahiti 4 years before with a remote control camera. And I said, I need one of these Ocean Eyes with a long cord, a remote control cord. And I went up to the photogrammetry company out in Rockville, Maryland, and they built me one. I sold a Hasselblad camera to buy it and brought the ocean eye with a long cord over, and we set it up outside of a blind, looking back toward the blind and the garden eels between the camera and the blind, and waited. And in about 10 days, we made the picture. And Jim said to me, he was very kind, and this is like collaboration. He said, anything that you shoot will help the story, and I'll be happy to turn it in. Because he was a staff photographer, didn't have to compete with anybody. And that's the kind of thing that makes people's careers.
Yeah. Because now suddenly
there's kindness and collaboration and a foot in the door.
That's really nice. Tell me, how incredible is Xposure? Because it's something special, isn't it?
Exposure is something that photographers dream about. This can't be happening. This is some place where I can exhibit my work. I can see others. I can see other works and exhibitions that are museum quality. It's something you can't even imagine. And talks and thoughts. Photographers are across the world best friends who never see each other. It's that connection, even at Geographic. All of us are friends and really good friends, but we see each other once or twice a year, if we're lucky, or once or twice every 5 or 6 years. I haven't seen Steve McCurry in 10 years, or Jim Nockway in 15 years. But, you know, these are friendships we know, we catch up with each other, and of course the internet connects everyone now, and everybody's looking, what are you doing, how are things going?
But here you can all
But
be
all
together.
of a sudden, here it is. So people say, well, do we really need this in this electronic Zoom world across continents and across seas that we can talk to each other instantly and show our pictures? Do we really need these things? Well, yes, this human connection really is important. It's like a medical connection. You can have as much papers published and as much Zoom conferences as you want, but if you put a group of doctors in a room or having dinner or drinking a glass of wine or giving a paper, all of a sudden you produce the kind of brain power and breakthrough that makes a difference.
Fantastic.
And this, you know, this is what's happening right here, right now. It is worth every penny for photographers. I just want more people to come.
Well, thank you, David, so much. This has
Thank
been
you.
an absolute pleasure and a chance to
Thank you.
get an insight into an incredible life. And thank you for your contribution to the planet and everything you've done, and for sharing it with us. Because I know for you, it's your story, and you probably, I've told this one 100 times, but you know, it's brand new for me. I'm sure it's brand new for the viewers. So thank you very, very much.
Neil, thank you.
What a pleasure.